Okay, we're going to talk about the Romantic era. So we just studied the Restoration period. Now we roll into the Romantic era in English literature, and it spans from 1798 to 1832. So that's the period of time that we'll be talking about for our next unit. So in 1798, the beginning of this era is marked by a book that came out by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. They published a book of poems. It's called Lyrical Ballads. It was kind of groundbreaking work, new poetry, two very famous poets collaborating, and it's still pretty famous work of literature. So that's the start of our era. In the backdrop, like what's going on, the French Revolution is kind of rumbling in the background. So some of their writing is influenced by just not wanting that revolution, that type of a revolution to happen in England. So you can see that reflected in some of their writing. The Romantic Age, what does this mean? Like when we think of romantic, we think of candles and flowers and, romance, but this is the older sense of the term. So when we're talking about the Romantic Age, it's when they're kind of idealizing, romanticizing, very imaginative types of writing, and then the writers would come back and they would stress, like, if we are going to idealize, we have to be able to use reason and judgment to prove it. So there was kind of this back and forth, like that's why it's romantic, because more and more they were stressing reason and judgment, and so those romantic ideals were written about, and then people would come back and try to back them up with reason and judgment. Historical background, I like to always give you historical background so you kind of know what's affecting the writers at this time. And during this time period, there are actually three revolutions in America, or in the colonies. There's the American Revolution, where America is becoming its own country, and England is a little bit feeling like a failure in this result because they're losing that land, they're losing that territory. So they're aware of the fact that the American Revolution is happening. Then in France, their neighbors, there's a revolution happening where you have a group called the Jacobians. You don't have to probably know their name, but rose up and had a revolution against the government, and they want to change. So in France, that's happening over there. And then in England, you have the Industrial Revolution. Now, this isn't a war. Those other two are wars. The Industrial Revolution is where you have factories now being created, and hand labor is becoming a thing of the past. And that causes a lot of different changes in English cities. So what is the Industrial Revolution? It's the shift from hand labor to machine labor. And factories are being built. The people are now moving into the cities. There's great urbanization because that's where the jobs are, in the factories. But the living conditions, because the cities are growing too fast, they're not ready for all of these people, this influx of people. And factories are being built, but there is no regulation on pollution, no regulation on, like, what do they do when they discard water that's been used maybe at their factory or in their machines. So lots of pollution, really unsanitary conditions. London becomes a very polluted city. The air is very polluted. And there are no child labor laws. So it was known that children would sometimes be like hooked up to coal. They call them sledges, where coal could be brought, because that was what was powering the machines in the factories, and the children would be pulling them at 4, 5, 6 years old. Nothing was stopping that. 18-hour workdays were very common. There was no labor laws to prevent people from having to work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. there were no labor unions protecting the workers. And because of this, working conditions were sometimes really bad. More often than not, they were bad. This was just a new way of doing things. So the Peterloo Massacre happened because the workers finally revolted. They'd had enough of it, and the massacre happened because they were suppressed into submission, and so many people of the workers were killed by their bosses, by the factory leaders, the factory supervisors. So there were like revolts like this throughout the country. It was kind of not a great time because England is sharply divided into two classes. You have the very wealthy and you have the very poor, and there's no middle at this time. So you have the haves and you have the have-nots, but you don't have a lot of middle ground. Something that the government kind of took a stance on at this time, it was called laissez-faire, which means allowed to do. So Parliament and the government decided to stay out of the industry, the factories. Like, laissez-faire means allowed to do. They didn't have any regulations. They weren't getting involved. And some of this had to do with King George III, who ruled from 1760 to 1811. And he didn't die in 1811. He was actually declared insane. So I've read lots of stories about him. He was kind of crazy for a long time. So he was not getting involved in the factories and the industry, and they were just kind of running wild. His son, the Prince of Wales, becomes the next king, and he is a regent. That's the title that went with him. So it's called the Regency, the era of Regency. And he was also pretty, what would I say, not crazy, but wild. Didn't really want, like, had fancy parties, didn't really want to do a lot with government, was passing off more to Parliament. So, therefore, in 1832, at the end of this age, the first reform bill is passed in Parliament, and this extends the voting rights to more people. No women yet, but more people. Before this, the only people who could vote had to be wealthy landowners. And now more people could vote, and this was the kind of the beginning of when there was going to be labor laws. So the first reform bill ends the Romantic era. But what's happening in literature, like during this time period? It's not a super long era, but we've got some great big names, big authors. The classicists. So when you think of the classicists, I want you to think of people who like follow the rules, like to follow the rules. They respect rules. Were kind of classic. This is William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. These two guys are two of the biggest poets to ever come out of England. We will read a little bit of their stuff later. William Wordsworth, fantastic poet. They're the classicists. Then we also have, kind of at the later part of the era, we have the neoclassicist poets. This is George Gordon Lord Byron, Mary Shelley. We know that she wrote Frankenstein, so we're getting to Frankenstein. P.B. Shelley, her husband, and then William Keats. And these people, if you think of them, I want you to think of them more of like hippies. So you've got Wordsworth and Coleridge, who are a little more tidy, follow the rules, and then you have these other poets who are kind of like, whatever, hippies, so to speak. That's what they would be thought of. Breaking the rules, bending, kind of setting their own pace. So we'll get a taste of both of their different types of writing. And that's it, I think, for today. We'll head into Wordsworth the next time I'm with you guys. Bye-bye.